From education to conflict and instability, leaders at the African Union Summit in Ethiopia discussed the top priorities for the continent. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Former South African President Nelson Mandela once said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world." Never have his words been so important as the African Union calls on member countries to invest more in quality education. A report by the African Union finds some 98 million school children are out of school, and the learning poverty rate is at 90%, meaning 9 out of 10 children cannot read or comprehend simple articles by the age of 10. Africa is facing numerous challenges, including inadequate infrastructure, poor funding, and armed conflict. CGTN's Robert Nagila begins our coverage with this report from Addis Ababa.
Education was the theme for the 37th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union. But at the opening ceremony, other pressing issues also took center stage. With his tenure as African Union Commission Chair drawing to a close, Moussa Faki, while acknowledging the milestones achieved in the past 7 years, was blunt in his assessment of the continental body.
The frantic tendency to make decisions without the real political will to implement them has grown to such an extent that it has become devastating to our individual and collective credibility. As an illustration, over the last 3 years, 93% of the decisions have not been implemented.
Faki painted a bleak picture of the continent's state of peace and security, referring to conflicts in the Sahel region, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, and the coups witnessed in recent months.
Never since the establishment of the African Union has such a number of transitions following unconstitutional change of government has been seen in Africa. Our failure to counter such a phenomenon is obvious.
Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, meanwhile, called for the continent to be self-sufficient as it pursues sustainable development.
We are blessed with favorable weather, arable land, water, forests, natural resources, and a large youth population who embody the great potential of our continent. We should not be seeking for aid.
Outgoing African Union Chairman Azali Assoumani, who is the President of Comoros, has been succeeded by President Mohamed Ghazouani of Mauritania, who will serve as AU chairperson for a period of 1 year. Ghazouani has pledged to focus on the continent's security.
Terrorism and civil wars in our continent generate a loss of life and a destruction of infrastructure and economic systems. All of this means that the fight for peace and security should be our first priority.
Robert Nagila, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
For more now on the African Union Summit and the challenges, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from London is Hannah Wanjie Ryder. She's the CEO of Development Reimagined and a senior associate with the Africa program at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Here in Washington, D.C., Abdullahi Boru Halakhe is an Africa security and policy analyst. Also with us from Johannesburg, David Monyae is an associate professor of political science and international relations and director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. And Joseph Ochieno is a writer and commentator on African affairs. He joins us from Kampala in Uganda. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Joseph, let me start with you. Just as we heard, the African continent faces formidable development problems, including the provision of quality education for youth in all the member states of the AU. Let's take Uganda as an example, no doubt a country that you are very familiar with. It budgets 2.2% of its GDP for education. That's well short of the international standard of 5%. So how does Uganda close that gap and in so doing improve the quality of education in the country?
it's extraordinary that you pick on Uganda for start. In the last 1 week, part of the conversation we've been having here is that education and health should see their budgets at least doubled. My argument has been that we need to treble. Even if we treble that budget, it will still be less than, if you like, the nearly 10% that Namibia spends. Now, if you consider the education that made who I am, I have argued, and it's been reported by, has been said by a report by President Nelson Mandela. My argument has always been that education is the #1 equalizer in society. It's what makes an average child from any part of this continent to become a top citizen of their country and indeed this country. So it's extremely important. Really, it's very much about deliberate policy driven by leaders at the top. Uganda had a projection for a universal primary education by 1972. That is within 10 years of our independence. Of course, that was interrupted by Idi Amin's regime. Universal primary education that was implemented in this country in 1997 or thereabout was one which was so shambolic that today, every year starts 1 million young people who start primary 1 do not complete primary 7. That is a million young people who get lost per year, and has been a huge debate. Unfortunately, there is insufficient political will for this conversation to take place, both from the ruling authorities and in many cases, opposition political parties. People just do not believe that education, that you and I are arguing about today, is perhaps much more critical, in many cases, perhaps, than health. So I think, interestingly, the day before yesterday, I think Ugandan Minister of Education, Primary Education, raised issues because actually the other day, young people going to secondary schools came up. Part of the other issue has now been cost of education, meaning that with the neoliberal agenda that came in as part of privatization, education was privatized. So now Uganda, amongst many African countries, find education extremely expensive. So rural education particularly is one in which it's unlikely that young people coming from where I came from, in the 70s and 80s, to be able to reach Makerere University or any top national university at all. So it's actually an urgent issue. So it's extremely a welcome issue that the African Union has put this on the top. I'm actually quite surprised that it came this late. But anyway, better late than never.
David, let's look at the situation in South Africa. During his recent State of the Nation address, the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, he said that the country has made significant progress in education since the end of apartheid in 1994. It's now 30 years after the end of apartheid. Yet, there was a 2021 report in which South Africa came last out of 57 countries on literacy tests. It suffers from the problems that we've been talking about, very familiar problems: poor infrastructure, inadequate training, vast inequalities. But the money is there in South Africa. It spends more than 5% of its GDP on education. But how does it use this money to improve the quality of education to get better outcomes?
I think the government is doing the best it can. However, as you have clearly stated, there are a number of challenges. Some have to do with the legacy of apartheid. Others have to do with the crisis that the ANC-led government caused itself in terms of the curriculum and quite a number of lack of adequate infrastructure, particularly in the rural areas and urban areas. And the challenge in terms of health and unemployment, which is directly affecting the education system. Like Uganda, a number of students, when they start grade 1, they really do not finish up to grade 7 right straight to high school and into universities. And therefore, there's massive improvement in some quarters, but it's still those in the middle class who are doing extremely well. And the recent results as we head towards elections are quite promising. However, I think more needs to be done to ensure that, as in line with the AU, you educate in Africa that is fit purpose for the 21st century. And therefore, we confront a crisis of education of the past and the need to leapfrog into a digital world and catch up with the developed countries.
Right, David, here's something of an anomaly when it comes to education in South Africa. I mean, if you look at South Africa's institutes of higher education, like the one where you are right now, it's arguably world-class education that's provided there. But when you look below that at high schools and primary schools and middle schools, there you find that education is sorely lacking. I mean, how do you explain this disconnect?
It has to do with the history of apartheid in the past and efforts being taken by the government in terms of ensuring that you equalize access to resources by universities, but far beyond university, to ensure that the flow of students from creche, primary, higher education, high school, right straight into university, there is somehow equality-based education received by all, but as it stands, you find poorer neighborhoods tend to get poorer results in terms of on-year basis, in terms of the outcome of metric results getting into the university. So the government really is doing the best it can in terms of putting more resources, but the challenge is far beyond just the question of access to resources. I think you need better training. You need an education system that is understood by community, the government itself, trade unions. It has to be a really united nation with one priority of ensuring that you take everyone on board in terms of receiving quality education right straight to university, as well as training people for skills, not just higher education, but ensuring that people are able to be do their own work using their own hands in terms of the training centers, like other countries in the world.
Abdullahi, let's look at one of the other challenges that many countries in Africa face, and that is political violence, which is impacting education on the continent. The African Union Summit identified political violence and tensions as one of the key challenges on educating young people. There have been coups in West Africa, there's continuing tensions in Eastern Congo, and of course there's that war in Sudan as well. UNICEF's Lika van der Weel, she explained the impact that this is having on education. Let's listen.
The problem with conflict is that very quickly schools tend to close. Of course, if there's conflict and people displace themselves, the families are being displaced, looking for safety, often the school doesn't come along. In fact, it's one of the first things that close, and that is harmful for the child. Not only will the learning be stopped, but also protection will be much less. A child is very much protected once in school, and also the socio-economic development is tremendously hindered.
So Abdullahi, here we have UNICEF telling us that, well, it estimates that there are 7 million children out of school in Sudan, for instance. 12 million have no space, that's no schools, and they don't have supplies as well. So how does the AU tackle these kinds of challenges?
No, thank you so much, and thank you to the other panelists. I think AU needs to step up. I think the most important thing, or the most effective way of doing that, is to look at not just education, but I think looking at peace and security as something that is critical. We're talking about Sudan, a country that many Africans used to come to in order to get educated. Now Sudan, especially its capital and eastern part of that country, has been laid to waste. I was in the eastern part of the DRC. Some of the schools, especially in Goma now, because of the conflict between M23 and the government, are now used as IDP camps. At night, they're IDP camps. During the day, they try and use it as schools. We're talking about millions who are out of school. So I think for the African Union, especially in the case of Sudan, it needs to take the driving seat in terms of trying to find a diplomatic and political solution. Short of that, by April, it will be 1 year since the start of Sudanese conflict, and we are only at the beginning of seeing its impact on children, on education, on health. Never mind, we are talking about half of the population in need of humanitarian aid. That is over 24 million people.
Hannah, Joseph was telling us a moment ago that one of the problems is that there is a lack of political will in many countries to see the value of education. But do you think there is a growing recognition right now? I mean, the fact that the AU has put this as one of its top priorities, is there recognition right now that there has to be a bigger focus on education?
Well, I think it's very easy to suggest that there's a lack of political will, but I think actually African Union member states, African governments do work very, very hard to try to provide education, to find the best models. And the African Union itself is a means of both kind of exchanging experience on what works, what doesn't work, and also to pool resources and to use our institutions in order to provide extra resources and cheaper resources in order to get there. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that you can have all the political will you want, but if you don't have the finance available, then the political will is going to go out the window. It doesn't matter. And I think that's one of the major constraints that African countries face internationally, is that there just is not enough finance on the continent to be able to deliver the kind of development that we need and that we see. And I think what was great to see even more strongly at this African Union summit is the push from many African leaders for more reform of the international financial architecture in order that African governments can get more finance to be able to pay for education, to be able to pay for healthcare, to be able to escape the kinds of conflicts that we find ourselves in, and ultimately, you know, really kind of deliver development. And I think that was a big push. You can't, if you're trying to deliver education, you can't just do it on its own. You have to look at the enabling factors around that, and finance is one of those key areas.
Joseph, what do you make, what is your view on what Hannah has just told us, that it's not really a matter of political will? The countries in the African Union or on the African continent are doing their best to give young people a good education, but there's also problems like a lack of funding.
I think generally Anna is right, but I think I'll respectfully slightly disagree, because I happen to have attended primary school in the 70s, and I happen to have experienced some of those schools, and I continue to go back around the country. I go around the country, and what I see today is clearly not what I saw then, number one. Number two, as I said, the first independence government deliberately using locally generated resources pushed for universal primary education, quality education, to the extent that even with the shambolic years of Idi Amin, halfway to Amin's regime, the system that existed in rural Uganda, for example, I mean, in terms of we're talking about access and quality, cannot be compared to today. I go around the country and I experience schools and institutions, and in fact, I am part of a major panel involved in the inter-university debates, and in the course of that, really, when you look at the quality of the education that in terms we're providing at the top end, you see that actually commercialization of education has been a major disaster. That said, if you look at education spend at, say, 2.2% and defense spending 4 to 5 times that, it's completely unexplainable. Really, in my opinion, it's leadership, it's a political will, it's a political direction. And I just suggest, as I said at the beginning, I'll repeat, I actually think that education, conversation around education, just like we have a conversation around health and infrastructure and agriculture, and now the environment, must be center stage. I don't know in some other countries, and as I said, it may not necessarily be across the continent, but I'm just using some of my own experiences. When I go across the border, maybe to Kenya, when you look at some of the things that has actually happened, possibly in Rwanda, because as I said, it should not really be a generic way. But I'm just using Uganda as an example. I think generally it's much more of a political will and how we generally redistribute and actually apply our resources. Granted, the continent needs to be supported in many of these cases, but just a quick one. You know, when we campaigned around the Jubilee 2000 and debt relief, you know, global communities actually gave a huge amount of money to support universal primary education across the continent. What it actually did in my country, I really don't have an experience of it in terms of quality education that I personally experienced at the time.
Can I just chip in?
Yeah, go ahead.
With respect to the funding dimension, I think both of them are saying something that is very important. You know, political will, you can have all the political will in the whole world. If that political will is not directed, it's not supported by funding, it's not supported by the right kind of model of education, it will be difficult. But the real problem is, moving forward, if you consider the debt crisis that many African countries are facing, the GDP debt ratio is really out of this world. That will become very, very problematic. Number two is the question of access. Even within the countries, just take Kenya, Uganda, whatever, the kind of educational access in rural areas and urban areas are not the same. If you speak about not access now, you go to the quality, it's not the same as well. I think there is an element of, class dimension to this as well, where people who come from certain, class have decided, look, public education is not working for us. We are taking our kids to private schools, and what that does is it sucks up the resources, it sucks up the parents who are really concerned, and they know what needs to be done, and people of certain income dimension are left there. And so there is also the private school, public school problem that is manifesting in many, especially urban areas across the continent.
David, if we look at South Africa again, I mean, the problem of educating the country's youth there is also compounded by the fact that there's such a high unemployment rate, especially among youth. I mean, the national unemployment rate is just over 30%. And when we look at the unemployment rate among youth, that figure jumps up to 52%. This is a comment we got from Nados Bekele-Thomas of the African Union Development Agency on that particular issue. Let's listen.
We cannot afford to have this high level rate of unemployment, but we cannot also industrialize unless, we focus on science, technology, education, and engineering and mathematics. So, it's very important that we do that. It's very important that we strategize on the artificial intelligence, on digitalization, because we are talking about the future, of our generation. And all these things are critical and very important ones. How do we make sure that the TVET schools are operational and they are functioning well, and they contribute to the employment, targets of this continent?
So, David, in addition to providing education, young people have to see a light at the end of the tunnel. But we look at these high unemployment rates, it looks a little bit hopeless, doesn't it? I mean, how does that aggravate, compound the problem in South Africa?
I think you have a crisis that, as much as you talk about the digitalization and the like, it's quite problematic when it comes to the poorest families, that they're unable to get sufficient food, and less so getting necessary facility, necessary transportation to enable the kids to be able to be in class and learn fully. And in most instances, I think you get some of these kids dropping out along the way, or stay in the system, but producing some of the poorest results. But this year's results in South Africa are quite promising. I think we're starting to see some of the poorest schools performing much, much better. And as we have this uneven development, that our universities are some of the best in the world, yet the crisis is right at crash level, at primary level. There is a need to do an overhaul of the entire system to ensure that you equip teachers, families, and have adequate infrastructure. When it rains, kids should be able to cross bridges, to be able to move in communities without crime, to have sufficient food in their stomach to stay throughout the day in class, and to avoid crime and the like, and in communities. And therefore, this should be the hallmark of governance, not just for ruling party, but the entire society and the region and the continent as a whole, to ensure that we have standards, common standards that are across the region here in Southern Africa, across the continent, that we all can measure and able to compete among ourselves as well as with the whole world.
Hannah, of course, there are a number of African countries that have entered into partnerships with other countries around the world to try and improve education standards in their own countries. Let's take China as an example. China is playing a major role in building schools across the African continent. China Daily newspaper reports that the country has helped build more than 170 schools, trained 160,000 professionals, and created 4.5 million jobs. That kind of involvement, China's involvement on the continent, what kind of a difference is it making?
Look, I think it's very useful to be investing, and as a bilateral partner, to be investing in education, not only at the primary level, but also at the tertiary level and so on, definitely. I'd say, however, that some of the best contributions that a country like China and other bilaterals have made, or even the multilaterals, is also building infrastructure and also industrializing, supporting industrialization. Infrastructure, you can't go to school if you can't cross that bridge. If you have to walk several miles to get to school, you'll be falling asleep in the classes. You will not have enough food, etc. These are the sorts of issues that bilateral partners can also support with. And the same with industrialization. You were asking David about unemployment. There's no point going to school if you are not going to have a job that's going to be better paying than being on your farm and supporting your parents doing that. And these are the very real choices that people have to make, that children have to make, that families have to make. And I think so bilateral partners not only are working directly on education, but also generally supporting budgets, supporting infrastructure, finance, and industrialization, transformation of African economies is the best way to go. And you don't just deliver education just by looking at education itself. There's no country that has this right or the right model. But if countries come together, countries work and learn from each other, and also learn from the other models that have been out there and used, then we can find a way forward.
Abdullahi, I was looking at one figure, very significant figure, while researching this show, and it shows that according to the African Development Bank, Africa's youth population will double to 850 million by 2050. I mean, that's not far away. Do you see a commitment there from the African Union to invest in the continent's youth?
In theory, yes, but in practice, it's going to be very difficult. I think that is why I think that even the continental body, I think I'm always attracted to the regional bodies, the SADC of this world, the East African communities, as well as the West African community, because I think some of these groupings tend to have, a fair degree of similarities to be able to pull these off.
Right.
But I think sometimes when we focus on the African education, like with many things, we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time, because there's the question of the hardware, the infrastructure, the roads, the buildings, the laboratories for high school students, universities, but also it's a question of software, the training of the teachers. Are you training, are you having a human resource for today, but also that can build for tomorrow? I think it's beyond the African Union. I think member states need to put on, to put their mouth where they put their money where their mouth is.
Hannah, Hannah, you wanted to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think there is an increasing commitment to dealing with that issue, but I think it's going to be very difficult to do unless the continent industrializes further. You can't provide jobs at that kind of scale. You can't provide education at that kind of scale if you don't have the resources to do that. And the only way you can get that is through making money as an economy and through industrializing. So I think this has got to be at the core of the agenda. And we do see African governments doing more and more on that. But I think the partnership with the rest of the world is crucial on it.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.